We recommend this product be installed by a competent gunsmith.
Modification of your firearm may nullify the warranty of the firearms manufacturer.
No liability is expressed or implied for damage or injury which may occur from improper use or installation of this product.
You are responsible for the safe handling, legalities, and use of your firearm.
Warning: always wear safety glasses when working on firearms. To reassemble the Sear housing block with factory components, I'll take my pin punch and fish the spring into the Sear housing block. I'll take my Sear plunger, which works very nicely with my slightly magnetic pin punch, set that on top of the spring. I'll take the factory Sear, which is shiny in color and normally has small holes in the sides. I'll put that on top of the plunger. I'll take my Sear pin and put it into the frame, into the Sear housing block, and I'll use my pin punch to press the Sear down and compress the spring and plunger. And I'll push the spring in, or the pin. If you can see the pin through this gap, you need to push the pin out so it clears that gap to allow the Sear actuator to go in. So I'll ever so slightly push that back, and I'll take the Sear actuator and I'll drop it in and fish it in to capture the Sear and put it in position. You can see here the lobe on the Sear is inside the two notches on the Sear actuator. I'll press the pin all the way through. If I can't press the pin through, I'll wiggle the Sear actuator until it captures and then push the pin all the way across. If you're installing our duty carry kit in your M&P M2.0, you'll want to install our purple Sear spring as opposed to the factory yellow, and the Apex 2. Sear instead of the factory Sear. All the other components will be the same. I'll start with the Sear spring. I'll fish it into the hole on the Sear housing block. Once that's in position, I'll use my slightly magnetized punch and I'll drop the Sear plunger on top of the spring. And I'll take the Apex 2. Sear and I'll set that into the Sear housing block. Try to get it on top of that Sear plunger. Now I'll take the pin punch and I'll press the Sear down to compress the plunger. And I'll use the Sear pin from the right side to the left, pushing it through the Sear to capture the Sear. I'll put it about halfway in. If I can see the pin in the gap, I've gone a little too far, so I need to just back that pin out until I have that gap clear for the Sear actuator to go in. Now I'll put the Sear actuator in and I'll capture the Sear lobe with that actuator. Make sure it goes on either side of the Sear cam lobe. From here, I'll push the Sear pin back in place. You'll notice that it normally doesn't go all the way through, so you have to wiggle the Sear actuator around until that pin goes in properly. Once it goes in, you should be able to push it all the way through the Sear housing block. If you're installing our forward set kit for the M&P M2.0, you'll want to use the purple Sear spring, factory Sear plunger, the Apex Sear for the M&P M2.0, which has 2 dots, not 3, the factory Sear pin, and the Apex Sear actuator. I'll start with our new Sear spring, put it in the Sear housing block. Once I have that installed, I'll take the Sear plunger, which is slightly magnetic on my punch, fish that into the Sear. I'll take the Apex 2. Sear, I'll drop it on top of the Sear plunger, and I'll use my pin punch to compress that spring. And I'll use the factory Sear pin from the other side to go into the Sear and capture that. I'll look into the gap here at the front and make sure that the pin is not protruding. If it is, I'll pull it back ever so slightly until it clears that gap. Now I'll take the Apex Sear actuator and I'll fish it between the Sear and the Sear housing block to capture the lobe on the Sear as it goes in. Once I have that installed, I'll press the Sear pin all the way through. If it doesn't go in right away, I'll need to start wiggling and moving around the Sear actuator until it goes. There it goes. Once I have it all the way installed, the Sear housing block is done. To replace the factory trigger with the Apex trigger, I need to first remove the trigger from the trigger bar. I'll place a pin punch on top of the pin on the trigger and give it a few taps and pull the trigger out of the trigger bar. To install the factory trigger bar into the Apex trigger, I'll take the trigger, I'll place the trigger into the slot and then I'll press until I hear it click in position. Now I have the trigger bar properly over the pin and I can seat the pin. Now I can take the piece of my business card, set it in the jaw, the vise, put that against the side body of our trigger, and I can slowly tighten up the jaw until it holds in place. Now I'll wiggle the trigger bar up and down as I close the vise jaws to get that pin to seat in position. And once I'm all the way down, I can open the jaws, and now my pin is just barely above flush. If necessary, I can put it on the vise anvil, and I can tap that pin down with my pin punch. Now that I'm flush, I can reinstall the trigger. To install the trigger return spring onto the trigger bar, I'll take the small end of the trigger return spring, hook it over the end of the trigger bar, and capture the end of the spring into the loop. Sometimes it'll take a few tries. Be patient with it. Once I have it installed, I'll roll the spring up into the trigger, and you'll notice that the gap in the spring is in the up position. This is the proper position for installation. Now we're going to assemble the trigger and slide lock lever assembly. With the trigger return spring on the trigger bar and the gap in the up position, I'll put the trigger return spring into the trigger, put the slide lock lever on top, and from the left to the right, I'll use the apex slave pin to capture the spring and everything all in one shot. I'll hold both sides and I'll grab the bottom of the trigger and the trigger bar and I'll squeeze. If that extends the spring, we know we've got a proper assembly. From here, I'll put it into the frame. Set the whole assembly in, make sure the slide lock levers sit in the frame as appropriate, and we're ready for the next step. I'll assemble the takedown lever and locking block next. I'll place the takedown lever all the way into the locking block. From here, I'll take it into the frame and slide it down all the way around the trigger. Once I'm there, I can turn it over and install the pin. Trigger pivot pin is the only solid pin with a head on it, a little cap there. I'll put the pin in from the left side to the right, and as I go, I'm trying to capture the trigger. And as you'll notice, the slave pin will push out as I push that pin in, and the slave pin oftentimes will come ejecting out. Once that pin's most of the way in, I can take my pin punch and just press it to final seat it in place. Once it's sub-flush, I'm in position. At this point, we're ready to put the Sear housing block in. I'll pull the trigger to pop the trigger bar up as high as possible. I'll take the trigger bar extension and put it into the Sear housing block so it goes underneath the Sear and in front of the Sear actuator. I'll slide the whole thing down into position into the frame, and it should click right into place. If you have trouble with this, make sure that the frame blocks are pushed all the way to the outside when you install it to make clearance. Now we're ready for pins. Installing the two remaining frame pins, the two pins are identical. They can be put in either hole. I'll put the rear one into the Sear housing block. I'll tap it down until it's almost flush. I'll put my pin punch on top, and I will final seat that pin where it's just below flush. I'll move the takedown lever slightly out of the way. I'll do the same thing with the locking block pin. Again, I'll punch it down until it's just below flush. Once there, I'll turn it over, double check my pins are not protruding, and from there I'm finished. Now I can do a safety check. To function check, I want to pull the trigger and make sure the trigger hits the Sear actuator, and that once it's hit, the Sear tips up. I'll do this a couple of times to make sure things work properly. And then I'll pin the trigger to the rear, holding the Sear down. I'll use my pin punch and push the trigger bar off to the right side of the frame to disconnect the Sear and actuator. I'll release this trigger to reset and reacquire the actuator, and I'll press it again. This is proper function of the system. If it doesn't look like this, you may need to disassemble and reassemble and try again. If you have a thumb safety model gun, you'll want to reinstall the thumb safety onto the Sear housing block. Put it on from the back, and I normally try to set it into the lower of the two notches, or the higher of the two notches on the thumb safety. If you have a thumb safety model of the M&P M2.0 and you happen to knock the thumb safety detent and spring out of the Sear housing block, put the spring back in. The spring goes to the front and the plunger points to the rear. Put the spring all the way in and it should just drop down into the frame relatively easily. From here, we'll put our thumb safety back on and I'll align the upper of the two notches into the detent. Now we're ready to put it back into the frame. To install the thumb safety Sear housing block, pull the trigger to pop the trigger bar up as far as possible. Now you want to fish the trigger bar extension into the Sear housing block underneath the Sear. This is a little more complicated in a thumb safety model because you can't see the notch as well. But we're going to drop that whole assembly down into the frame, capture it into its guides, and drop it all the way down. Now, a lot of times you need to use a pin punch as a slave pin on the back of the frame to help line up for the pin to go in. So from here, I'll take the pin punch, put it all the way through. I'll take my frame pin, and I'll use that to press the frame pin, to punch my pin out while I push the other one in. Sometimes it's necessary to hold it with one hand and use a hammer to tap that pin in while you allow the pin punch to be guided out. Once we're most of the way down, we can seat that pin just below flush and we're complete. To function test, I'll pull the trigger, watching the trigger bar hit the Sear actuator and pick up the Sear. I'll release that and check it a couple of times. With the thumb safety in the up position, I'll pull the trigger again and you'll notice the Sear and actuator do not move. I'll drop the safety back down and retest. If this looks like this, it's normal and you're ready to put the slide back on.